Hi you guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It would mean so much to me, and I hope you guys enjoy these videos. Also, if you want to see more, leave a comment down below, leave a suggestion, a true crime case, and let me know what you want to see next. So today's case I kind of came upon super randomly, but I thought it was really interesting, and I didn't get a ton of information, especially in Australia, and it's an old case, so like there wasn't a ton of information about it, but I thought it was a really interesting case. But I have to say it's a pretty brutal case. A young couple with a promising future were abducted, tortured, and then murdered around Valentine's Day in 1971. And this case is one that still puzzles authorities till today. So let's talk about the case of Jesse McBane and Patricia Mann. Jesse McBane was 19 years old and he was super popular and attended North Carolina University. He was a freshman, he was athletic, he was smart, and he was actually a pretty good looking guy. He was also voted most likely to succeed by his peers. Patricia Mann was 20 years old at the time, and she was studying to be a nurse at the hospital. And Patricia and Jesse were either engaged or talking about getting engaged, but they were definitely high school sweethearts. So on Friday, February 12th, 1971, in Durham County in North Carolina, it was a cold night with misty rain falling throughout much of the evening, and the local Valentine's Day dance was taking place that evening. So Jesse, he had a car, but he actually shared that car with his brother, and that night was actually his brother's turn to take the car out, but he ended up working out a deal with his brother so that he could use the car that night to take Patricia out to the Valentine's Day dance. And this dance was taking place where Patricia actually worked at the Watts Hospital in Durham. So before they left to the dance, Patricia, she goes with Jesse to her dorms, and then she has to sign out for the night to be able to go to the dance. And that night, because the dorm, like authorities, knew that the dance was taking place, so they allowed all the students to have a later curfew that night. So normally they had to be back by like 11:30 p.m., but they extended it to 1 a.m. to allow the kids to just enjoy themselves at the dance and not worry about, rushing back. And I find colleges in the US so interesting. Like, I've only ever been to one, and it was in Chicago. I think the university was called Northwestern University. And my cousin lived there, so we ended up like going to the university and checking it out. And we walked around campus, and it was just like so cool. Like, even the stores around the area, like around the universities, are so cool. In Australia, we rarely live in dorms. Like, we have so many universities around us, like in the city. So majority of us don't live on campus. We just kind of stay at home, or, campus life just sounds so cool to me. Am I weird? And it's so cute that like you have to sign out, of like the dorm so you don't miss out on curfew. I mean, it's a good thing, but it's also kind of weird, like when you're in your 20s, like if you still have to do that. I don't know. It just sounds really cool to live super independently, but then it's kind of not, but it kind of is. Anyways, back to the story. Patricia and Jesse just seemed so sweet. They were young, they were in love, and it almost just sounds like right out of a little movie. So they go to the dance, and either, they leave early, or when the dance finishes, they end up taking Jesse's car, and they drove down to the present day neighborhood of Croasdale. And in the year 1971, in that area, there was a ton of cul-de-sacs, but there wasn't any houses built in those cul-de-sacs as yet. So in Australia, we call them courts, where it's almost like a keyhole street, like with a dead end, and you can't pass through the street. Like, we call it courts in Australia, but in America, I think they call them cul-de-sacs. So if you can imagine, it's almost like multiple private streets, because there's only one way in and then it kind of like ends, right? So this area was the unofficial lover's lane for all the nursing students in the area who, wanted some sexy time with their boyfriends and girlfriends, and just to, enjoy their time as young kids on their own without any interruptions. So the unspoken rule between all the nurses was that if you drove into a cul-de-sac and there was already a car over there, you leave and you just go find the next free one. And there were even a few couples who had like specific streets that were theirs, you know what I mean? Like nobody else was allowed to take their spot because people, in case they come there that night, like that's their spot. So it's basically one couple, one car per street when they're doing their things, which is exactly what you want as a teenager. Like you just want a spot where no one bothers you. I mean, they're not all teenagers. Some of them are in their 20s, but still, when you're 20, you're still young. So it's nice that they just kind of had like their own spots and they just got to live their life, And I thought it's just so cute and sweet and innocent, but at the same time, it's like sweet and innocent. It's not really, because we all know what they're doing in their cars, right? Right? And isn't it also kind of weird that like if you're all students that at this school and then you like drive into a cul-de-sac and then you see your friend's car and you're like, oh, it's taken by them. And then you have to leave, but then you know exactly what they're doing in that street. Like, that's weird, right? Anyway, so that's where Jesse and Patricia went that night after the dance, and they just hung out there in their car doing what young couples do. But Jesse and Patricia never came back. For Patricia, her 1 a.m. curfew came and went, and no one had seen them. So the next day, it's Saturday, and Patricia's roommates were really concerned because Patricia had never broken curfew. Patricia was described as someone who was super responsible, and she took her nursing school really seriously, and she always went by the rules. And all accounts of Jesse was that he was a really good guy and he wouldn't make Patricia do anything to go against, her moral codes, even if it was something as silly as skipping curfew. He just wouldn't do that. So Patricia's roommates were really concerned, so they began calling local hospitals to see if maybe there had been a car accident. They also filed a missing persons report with the Durham County. And then as they were waiting for all of this to sort of come up with a result, they couldn't sort of wait any longer. So they decided, you know what, we're just going to go ahead and physically look for them. So they went to Jesse and Patricia's local spots, the spots that they would normally hit up, including the nurses, Lover's Lane, where all those private cul-de-sac streets were. So as they were looking through those streets, they ended up finding Jesse's car in one of the streets. And back in those days, cars had these triangular windows, vents that you could just push in. So one of the girls was able to push that vent in, reach in, unlock the car, and they opened up the car and they just wanted to see, because obviously, Jesse and Patricia weren't in the car, so they wanted to see if things were missing, what happened. So their coats, both Jesse and Patricia's coats, were in the back, and nothing seemed to be missing and nothing seemed to be damaged in the car. And there had been no signs of a struggle, and the car, it was still locked when they found it, and it seemed like fingerprints had been wiped away. But like I mentioned before, Jesse and Patricia were, obviously not in the car, and they were nowhere to be found even on the street. So now, after the car's discovery, both families of Patricia and Jesse were fully notified that they were missing, and the police decided to act on the initial missing persons report that Patricia's roommates had made earlier that morning. So initially, investigators had suspected that perhaps Jesse and Patricia, with it being Valentine's Day and they wanted to be romantic, that maybe they just got swept up in the idea of Valentine's Day and they, ran away to elope and get married. But within a day or two of them being missing, it became clear to investigators that something was just not right. And what initially began as just a missing persons case quickly evolved into something much more disturbing. At this point, though, still nobody had any idea that this was actually a homicide investigation. They still believed it to be just a missing persons case. Caroline Spivey was Patricia's cousin, and they actually grew up next door to each other. They were neighbors. And Caroline states that they were actually best friends. And when she was informed that Patricia was missing, Caroline stated that she just got the sickest feeling in her stomach, and she just knew that something terrible had happened. And it was noted that when Patricia initially began dating Jesse, that Caroline began dating Jesse's best friend. So all of them were kind of really close. For nearly 2 weeks since their disappearance, Police and local search parties, they just combed through the area, and investigators, they followed up on every single lead, but they just kept turning up empty, empty, empty every single time. So on February 25th, 1971, just over 10 days since Patricia and Jesse went missing, a surveyor was working in a heavily wooded area along a one-lane dirt road. And at the time, it was privately owned land. So this guy was just working, doing his job, and he sees what he thinks or what looks like a mannequin leg sticking out of a bunch of leaves and debris. So he just thinks like, oh my God, someone's just gone and dumped some stuff in this area. Let me go ahead and just get rid of it or just have a look. So as he gets closer, he looks again and he realizes it's a human body. So he calls the police immediately, and then they come quickly and then they work the scene of the crime. Now, the police were obviously on high alert. They knew that a couple had been missing, so they went to work. And that same day, those two bodies were identified as the remains of Jesse and Patricia. So this is the messed up part. Both Patricia and Jesse had been tied to a tree with their backs. So they were tied with their backs facing the tree, and both their hands were tied behind their backs too, like around the tree trunk. And there was rope around their head and their necks. And although their bodies had been like secured against the tree, after they, had passed away, their bodies leaned forward and then slumped down together, which ended up having them wrap around each other and reach the ground laying side by side together. Does that make sense? So they were standing up, they were standing up like this on the tree. They both slumped down together and then kind of came forward and were laying next to each other on the ground, and the leaves and everything from the weather had partially covered them. And Jesse was found still wearing his class ring and his watch, so the police determined that this couldn't have been a robbery. Those items would have been taken. The medical examiner actually found no signs of sexual assault on Patricia or Jesse, but Patricia had internal injuries from being punched, kicked, and stomped on. Authorities said the couple was also stabbed multiple times, and the crime scene photos were gruesome. Further, there were multiple strangulation marks around their neck, which basically indicated to police that the rope that was around their necks had been tightened and loosened multiple times. The police concluded that they had been strangled and then let down, strangled and then let down, strangled and then let down. So much so to the point that their shoes were covered in mud, and the areas that they were standing, they dug almost like little holes with their feet because they were thrashing around so much. So they were really, really tortured, really tortured. The person or people doing this to Patricia and Jesse, their acts were just straight up torture. Straight up torture. And the police believed that there was a certain degree of planning that had obviously taken place to enable this crime to happen. And it was more possible than not that the person attacking the couple had known the couple personally. So this new area that Patricia and Jesse were found at was also known to be another lover's lane for young couples. And it was a road that had been sort of pushed in, and there was a cul-de-sac at the end, and it was about a quarter mile into the woods, and it was very, very secluded, more so than the previous lover's lane that they were at. And the ground over there was littered with cigarettes and beer bottles, and it was just a place where young people would go to just screw around. The area where their bodies were found were also located right on the county line of Orange County and Durham. So because of this, an extensive investigation took place where both the Orange County Police Department and the Durham County Police Department were trying to figure out what had happened, what took place that night, and how they ended up there. But as Detective Tim Horn at the time put it, there was a lack of collaboration between the two counties and the police departments, and everybody individually worked on the case, and the case itself didn't gain much traction. There was a lot of work done, but the work was done individually and it wasn't shared around, and the information wasn't passed between the two counties or even between certain detectives and police workers. So my mic decided to be a darling and do its thing again. So let me go back and tell you what happened. So through all this chaos of everyone trying to work together but not work together, they were all doing their own thing, there did emerge a few suspects, and some were cleared by polygraph tests and then some failed. And then one in particular was a doctor who worked at the Watts Hospital with Patricia. And not only did he work at the same hospital, he worked like with her. And after he failed the polygraph test, he just repeatedly refused to cooperate with the police. He was just basically being an asshole. And this behavior ended up making him the police's biggest suspect. And this doctor was the focus of this case and the biggest suspect in 1971. And Detective Horn says he's still the focus till today. And because no one ever really, like none of the police officers ever really zeroed in on one of the suspects, like even though the doctor was the biggest suspect, they never really like zeroed in on him. The case ended up going cold, which is really sad considering what these two families went through. And then to be killed in such a horrific way for what? They had no reason. And then knowing that the case barely gained any traction and the police really couldn't even zero in on a suspect, and then knowing that the doctor could just get away with not cooperating with the police, like how difficult must that have been? And I wonder why the doctor wasn't sort of like forced or brought in on a warrant. Like, did they just really have barely any evidence? Because then that means that this killer is a pretty good one if he got away with it with two victims. So Tim Horn, he works for the Orange County Department, and in 2014, Caroline, Patricia's cousin, the one that was really close to her, contacted him with rumors and or tips about a possible suspect that she had heard, around the way. So Horn, along with his partner Dawn, opened up the cold case, and they began looking through all the old boxes of paperwork, records, and evidence. And for a few years, they ended up revisiting like the old suspects in the case. They began looking for new ones and just began putting together as much information as possible, piecing together parts of a puzzle that previous investigators had just failed. So the original investigators who were still alive, they ended up getting a call from Detective Horn, who asked them to come down to the sheriff's office and just go through the details of the case with them. So Detective Horn, he ends up putting on a presentation for these older investigators, and most of the evidence and information that was presented to the investigators was either new to some of them or they just had never heard of it. And most of the information that Detective Horn put forth in this presentation to the older investigators was new to some or all of the older investigators. They had never heard of it. And the reason for this being was back in 1971, they just never shared all their pieces of information across the counties with each other, and they just kind of held it back. So when they were being presented this new evidence, they were like, whoa. And if it had been shared between the counties and all the investigators, Detective Horn, he believes that the outcome of this case would have been very different. Maybe we would have actually made an arrest. I mean, to me, this is so silly. Aren't you all working on the same case? Like, why are we hiding information from each other? Was it that whoever was working individually on the case wanted to be the one to crack the case? Like they wanted to be the star of the case? Wouldn't you rather just have a solution rather than just, I don't know. It's just such bad police work, I believe. I mean, but when the goddamn case was not getting cracked and it was turning cold, shouldn't they have decided to just share all the information together? Like, isn't that just so silly? Band together, put together all the information across all counties that had been discovered and work together as a team to get a better idea of what had happened that night. I mean, it was such a horrible crime to two people so young. And what was the motive? What was the reason? If they had just done this, put all their thoughts together, put all their evidence together, they could have probably uncovered something that wouldn't have made this case cold. And not only to mention, do it while the case is still fresh, right? Before it turns cold. So till this day, only one suspect is alive, and I feel there's a huge reason why the universe has kept this person alive, and that suspect is that same doctor from the Watts Hospital. Now, Detective Horn won't say exactly why the doctor is a suspect. They've never shared that information as to what ties him to the case, apart from obviously working with Patricia. But he shares that when the original investigators had come by Horn's request to learn of the new evidence of the case, they contacted that doctor and they asked him, they asked him to come down and why don't you just take another lie detector test? Now it's been 30 something years since, no, more than 30 years, like 40 years since that crime took place, and the initial lie detector test would have happened. Now, again, we know that lie detector tests are not super accurate, but if you're guilty, you don't even want to come close to looking more guilty by failing a lie detector test. So that doctor, when he gets the request from the original investigators to do another lie detector test, he calls his lawyer, and through his lawyer, he declines politely. So now, nearly 50 years later, Detective Horn contacts that doctor and asks him, okay, do you want to provide a DNA sample? What did that doctor do? He called his lawyer and he politely declined. If that ain't suspicious, I don't know what is. Okay, guys, if you haven't noticed, I'm doing a kind of a simple look, nothing complicated, because a lot of you guys have stated that you like, you like the easier looks. So I got this new lip gloss in the mail. I just used Morphe, what is it called? Makeup Talk lip liner, which is kind of just like a little bit deeper than my natural lip line. And I got this new lip gloss in the mail. What are you called? This is the Fenty Beauty Gloss Bomb Heat. And apparently it like tingles and makes your lips a bit bigger. These things never work for me. Not that I want bigger lips, but you know what I'm saying. So this shade is in the shade Hot Cherry. I think it's going to be gorgeous. It's like a really juicy red, but I don't think it's super pigmented. It's just, I always love their packaging. I'll get back to the story. Let me just show you the lip gloss. Oh, it smells really good. It smells like those lip smackers. Ooh, I like it. See how it's kind of sheer, but it gives you a little bit of color? I like that. I usually don't apply lip gloss. Okay, back to the story. I'll tell you if it tingles, but so far, nothing yet. So although no one has officially been charged with this case, none of the suspects, the Orange County Sheriff's Department believes that they may soon possibly crack this case and come up with an ending to it. So obviously DNA has evolved in the last 50 years. It's evolved incredibly. And they have this new DNA collection system, which is called the MVAC. And it's basically a wet vacuum DNA collection method that was originally designed to determine like potential pathogens in food samples. My lips are burning. And it's basically like an industrial carpet solution cleaner, similar to the Bissell. So it'll spray a solution out and then it'll suck all the liquid up together with that solution, and then it'll like divide up the DNA and the evidence. Oh, my lips feel like, oh. So only 80 MVAC systems exist in the world, with 40 being provided to the USA. And fortunately, the Orange County Sheriff's Department has received an MVAC system. So they still have these ropes that were used on Jesse and Patricia, and these ropes were preserved. In my previous case, I think it was the Kitty Genovese case, people were commenting saying that why hadn't the DNA sort of been kept and preserved? Well, in this case, it was kept and preserved. So after nearly 50 years, there's a chance that this case could possibly have some closure. The potential suspect could be taken into custody and tried for these brutal murders after getting away with it for 50 years if this person is still alive. The detective and a lot of consultants believe that possibly somewhere, I mean, there's a high chance that you're going to have some DNA of that suspect on that rope. And this new MVAC technique or the new MVAC machine with the technique that they use is the best one to extract and obtain such type of DNA from such type of material like the rope. What a horrible tragedy, especially for like, I keep calling them kids. I think of them as kids because they're still in college, but they're just starting out their lives, and then to be kidnapped and abducted from like a lover's lane. Imagine like what they were feeling. They were probably so excited, spending Valentine's Day, like, you know, celebrating Valentine's Day at least together. And then what happened? Did they get abducted from their car? Like, can you imagine how scary that would have been? Then being transported to another location, and how were they transported? Because it wasn't close to each other. Marching up an embankment and then being tied to a tree with your back against the person that you love. And imagine Jesse, he was probably trying to protect Patricia too. Then being bound and strangled, and then repeatedly strangled and tortured. Like, can you imagine what they went through? They were probably so happy and in love and just enjoying their night together. Like, things back in the 70s, just back in the day, were just so much more innocent. There was less drama. And for their night to end in such a horrific way, I just have no words. So till this day, the case of Jesse McBane and Patricia Mann still remains open and unsolved. This case is honestly so scary, and the fact that it's still unsolved is even scarier. Did none of those other students in those like other cul-de-sacs hear anything? Did Jesse and Patricia make no noise? I mean, you know, like in movies, I don't know, tell me if you guys have ever been to one of this, especially you guys out in the USA or any other countries that have this kind of area. But you know, in the movies, especially in The Simpsons, you see like cliffs that kids and students or young couples go up to, and they like park their car at the edge of the cliff and they overlook the whole city, and it's like the makeout zone, and that's where they hang out, and the cars are like parked side by side next to each other, and you're just like making out and doing things right next to each other. But in a situation like that, if one of the cars was attacked, at least there were other witnesses because they were right next to each other. I mean, each of these cul-de-sacs that Jesse and Patricia were in were occupied by just one car each, and which is crazy because there was probably more than enough room for multiple cars on that one street, considering how many houses can be built on those streets. But perhaps the killer knew this. He knew that the area was very isolated because these kids wanted their privacy, and he knew how secluded it was. And when I looked it up, the area from where Jesse and Patricia's car was left, so Lover's Lane, that nursing Lover's Lane, to the new Lover's Lane was like 4 miles apart. So like, how did they get there? There was no evidence of tire marks. Like, I wonder how they got there. Now, that doctor, from what I've read, there's no clear reason, at least that I could find, of why he was such a huge suspect. But the only thing I can think of is, if he was working with Patricia at the hospital, what if he liked her? What if he became obsessed with her? And maybe she rejected his advances, and the fact that it was Valentine's Day, maybe he knew that she would be with her boyfriend, especially because she was a nurse in Nurse's Lover's Lane. So maybe that's a connection. Not to mention it was the Valentine's Day dance. So it wasn't actually Valentine's Day, but if it was the dance, like the time the dance was taking place, he knew that all the couples would be like woozy in love and maybe drinking, and who knows. I mean, he's a doctor, he probably has money, and he has good lawyers, and his lawyers know, you know, loopholes and ways to get him out of talking to the police, not only due to the lack of evidence, but if there is no evidence, the fact that he wouldn't cooperate with the police just makes him look even more guilty, because if you had nothing to do with it, why wouldn't you do everything you could to help, right? Anyway, I can't remember if I've done any unsolved cases. I think this may be my first one. I may be wrong. So I really hope it gets solved soon. So the fact that they're still working on it, and with this new technology, it would be so interesting to find out what actually happened to them and who did it and why they did it. Well, I know what I won't be doing this Valentine's Day, and you guys should probably stay away from fooling around and doing the deeds in parked cars in secluded streets. Just saying. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed this makeup look. If you want to check out some of my other videos, click over here, and I will see you in the next one, guys. Besitos. Mwah. Bye. Hot besitos. My lips hurt, actually.